For nearly 2,000 years, one method of execution defined an entire empire's power. Rome crucified thousands of people, rebels, slaves, political prisoners. It was public, it was constant, it was meant to be seen. And for centuries, archaeology found almost nothing. Not one skeleton, not one bone. Not one physical trace of a body that had actually been nailed to a cross. That absence is strange when you think about it. Crucifixion is one of the most documented practices in the ancient world. Historians wrote about it, legal texts describe it, the Gospels describe it in detail most readers skip past. But the ground stayed silent. For nearly 2,000 years, there was no direct physical evidence anywhere that crucifixion left the kind of proof you could hold in your hand. A construction crew, not archaeologists, broke through first, clearing ground for new apartment blocks on the edge of the city. What they found underneath stopped the work entirely. 4 burial caves, cut into bedrock, sealed since before the Second Temple fell. Israeli archaeologists were called in immediately, and what they cataloged over the following months would end up rewriting a page of history nobody had expected to be rewritten that year. Inside was a stone box. Inside the box were the bones of a man named Yehohanan, and inside his heel bone was a nail. It had been there for 2,000 years. It was never supposed to survive. The reason it did is almost an accident, a mistake made by a Roman soldier that nobody was meant to remember. But that mistake is the only reason we know, physically, exactly what a Roman cross did to a human body. And what it reveals is not what you've seen in a painting. This is the only bone in the world that proves crucifixion happened exactly the way ancient sources say it did. And by the end of this video, the picture in your head of the cross is going to look different. To understand why this bone matters, you have to understand who Yehohanan was, or at least what the evidence tells us about him. His name survives because of an ossuary. In 1st century Judea, burial was not a single event. Bodies were laid in a tomb for about a year, left to decompose. Then, in a practice called ossulegium, family members returned, gathered the bones, and placed them in a small limestone box, an ossuary, often inscribed with the name of the deceased. It was an act of reburial and of remembrance. Thousands of these boxes have been found around Jerusalem. Most say nothing more than a name. Stone doesn't decay the way bone or wood does, and that's exactly why these boxes are one of the richest sources archaeologists have for everyday life and death in 1st century Jerusalem. Yehohanan's ossuary carries a short inscription scratched into the stone. His name and the name of his father, though scholars still debate exactly how to read the second word of that inscription. That kind of uncertainty is normal in epigraphy, and worth saying out loud rather than pretending the reading is settled. What is not in question is the method of his death. Crucifixion in 1st century Judea was not a punishment handed out for ordinary crime. Rome reserved it for a specific category of offender: rebels, insurgents, escaped slaves, people who threatened the political order directly. It was designed to be visible. A crucified body left on display was a message to everyone who walked past it. This is what happens when you challenge Rome. Roman practice often included a placard, a titulus, listing the condemned person's crime, nailed above the head, so that the punishment explained itself to anyone passing by. It's the same practice that shows up in the Gospel accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, where a sign reading the charge against him is placed above the cross. It wasn't an invention for the scene, it was standard procedure. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing decades later in his account of the Jewish War, described mass crucifixions carried out by Roman forces during the later revolt against Rome, at one point noting that so many prisoners were being crucified around the city that there was no more room for crosses, and no more crosses for the bodies. Josephus wasn't exaggerating for dramatic effect. He was a first-hand witness to how routinely Rome reached for this specific punishment whenever its authority in Judea was challenged. This was also an era when Rome's patience with Judea was thin. A string of Roman prefects and procurators governed the province through the first half of the century, ruling through a local aristocracy that answered to them, and tension between the occupying power and factions within Jewish society, some accommodating Rome, some actively resisting it, never fully eased. Groups later known as the Zealots and the more radical Sicarii would eventually push that tension into full-scale revolt in 66 AD. Yehohanan's execution sits somewhere inside that decades-long buildup, evidence that Rome was willing to use its most public, most brutal punishment on ordinary Judean subjects, not just on figures who made it into the history books. The dating on Yehohanan's remains, based on the style of the burial cave and the script of the inscription, places his death somewhere in the 1st century, in the general period before the Second Temple's destruction in 70 AD. He is a contemporary, broadly speaking, of the world the Gospels describe. But here's what nobody expects going into this story. The bones themselves were not the first thing to make headlines. It was what came out of them. Because to get to the truth about how Rome actually crucified people, we first have to go to the place where his bones were found, and to the moment the assumptions built on top of them turned out to be wrong. The site is called Giv'at ha-Mivtar in the northern part of Jerusalem. Today it's an ordinary residential neighborhood. In 1968, before the apartment blocks went up, construction crews broke into a network of burial caves cut into the rock. 4 tombs in total, used by Jewish families in the 1st century. Inside, archaeologists found the kind of burial architecture typical of the period. Narrow burial niches called kokim, cut horizontally into the rock walls, each one sized to hold a single body during the year it spent decomposing before the bones were gathered. The excavation was carried out by Vassilios Tzaferis, working with Israel's Department of Antiquities. Inside one of the caves, in an ossuary catalogued as Tomb 4, Ossuary 4, alongside other ossuaries belonging to what appears to have been the same extended family, archaeologists found the remains of Yehohanan, and something they had never encountered before in decades of excavating Judean burials. Both of his heel bones, the calcanei, were still connected by a single iron nail, 11.5 centimeters long. Fragments of olive wood clung to both ends of it, remnants of the wood the nail had been driven through. There was also damage to his right tibia, consistent with a hard blow meant to fracture the bone, a detail that lines up with a practice historians call crucifixion, breaking the legs of a crucified person to speed up death by removing their ability to push themselves up to breathe. Of the thousands of Second Temple period burials excavated around Jerusalem, only this one preserves direct physical trauma matching crucifixion. That scarcity is itself data, a reminder of just how thoroughly Rome's system of nail recovery worked, and how much of the ancient record simply isn't there to find. The remains were transferred to the Israel Antiquities Authority, where they, along with the ossuary itself, remain part of the country's national archaeological collection, catalogued and available for exactly the kind of re-examination that led to the 1985 correction in the first place. The initial study of the remains was published in 1970 by physical anthropologist Nicu Haas. It became an instant sensation, the first physical, skeletal proof that Roman crucifixion happened exactly the way ancient texts described it. Haas proposed a reconstruction, both feet nailed together, side by side, through the front of a single upright wooden beam, with a small olive wood plaque functioning as a footrest. That reconstruction became the image printed in magazines and textbooks around the world. For over a decade, it was treated as settled fact. It wasn't. In 1985, physical anthropologists Joseph Zias and Eliezer Sekeles went back to the remains and re-examined them directly. Publishing in the Israel Exploration Journal, they identified problems with Haas's original reconstruction that the first analysis had missed. The nail was too short to pass through both heels, and a footrest plaque the way Haas proposed. The angle and position of the bones didn't support feet stacked one on top of the other. Their corrected picture was different and stranger. Each foot, they argued, had likely been nailed separately to either side of the upright beam, with the legs bent at the knee and rotated to one side. Not a symmetrical front-facing posture, a twisted one. That correction matters for reasons that go beyond one skeleton. It tells us Roman crucifixion wasn't a single standardized procedure carried out the same way every time. Ancient sources describing crucifixion, including Roman writers themselves, mention variation. The philosopher Seneca, writing in the 1st century, described watching crucifixions with his own eyes and noted that victims were positioned differently from case to case, some with their heads turned toward the ground, some with limbs stretched out in different configurations across the wood. Different postures, different numbers of nails, sometimes ropes instead of nails, sometimes both. Yehohanan's bones are consistent with that variation, not with the clean, uniform image most people carry in their heads. And there's one more detail in this re-examination that almost nobody talks about: the reason the nail was still in the bone at all. That detail isn't a footnote, it's the center of this entire story. Here is the detail that changes everything. The nail bent. Not from the force of the crucifixion itself, but earlier, while it was actually being driven into the wood. At some point, the tip of that iron nail struck a knot inside the olive wood beam. Knots in wood are hard, dense, unpredictable. The nail hit one, and instead of driving straight through, it curved. That bent tip is why the nail could not be pulled back out. Under normal circumstances, Roman executioners removed the nails from crucified bodies. Iron was valuable. Nails were reused, pulled from one execution, driven into wood for the next. That single fact explains almost everything about why archaeology had never found direct physical evidence of crucifixion before Yehohanan, and has barely found any since. The evidence was recycled out of existence over and over for centuries. Yehohanan's executioners tried to remove his nail. They couldn't. The bend, catching against the wood and the bone, made it impossible without destroying the foot entirely. So they left it. The body was buried, heel bone, nail and all, and that accident, that one imperfect strike against a knot in a piece of olive wood 2,000 years ago, is the only reason anyone alive today has ever held physical proof of a Roman crucifixion. Think about what that means. This isn't a story about archaeologists finding what they expected to find. It's a story about the only surviving exception to an entire system built to erase its own evidence. Rome didn't leave this behind on purpose. Rome tried to take it back. For decades, some scholars argued that the Gospel writers wrote generations after the events and dramatized details of Roman punishment for theological effect. That specifics like nails through hands and feet were literary flourishes, not documented procedure. Yehohanan doesn't settle every question in that debate, but he removes one argument from the table entirely. Nailing through the extremities, in exactly the position the Gospels describe, is not an invention. It's a documented Roman practice, confirmed by a body that predates the writing of any gospel. And once you sit with that, the corrected reconstruction from 1985 stops being a technical footnote about bone angles and becomes something else entirely. A first-hand, physical record of what a Roman execution actually did to a human body. Not the sanitized, symmetrical image passed down through centuries of religious art. A twisted, asymmetrical, improvised act of violence, carried out by soldiers who had likely done this many times before and would do it many times again. If you've made it this far, you're the kind of person who wants the real picture, not the postcard version. So before we go further, subscribe, because this channel exists to keep going past the version of these stories everyone thinks they already know. There's also a broader debate this discovery quietly entered. For much of the 20th century, some scholars argued that specific physical details in crucifixion narratives, piercing of hands and feet, described centuries earlier in poetic language like Psalm 22, were symbolic, not literal, or were retrofitted by later writers to match older texts. Yehohanan doesn't resolve every argument in that debate, and it would be dishonest to claim it does. But it does establish, physically, that nailing through the extremities of a crucified body was standard enough Roman practice to leave evidence in the ground. Historians can debate meaning and intention. They can no longer argue that the physical practice itself was invented. It's worth being honest about the limits here too. One skeleton cannot tell us how common this exact posture was across the empire, or whether every crucifixion looked like Yehohanan's. What it can do, and does do, is remove the single biggest objection skeptics have raised for over a century. The claim that the physical mechanics described in ancient crucifixion accounts were invented, exaggerated, or borrowed from literary tradition, rather than observed reality. A bent nail in a heel bone doesn't argue. It just sits there, in a drawer in Jerusalem, being exactly what it is. There's a second detail worth sitting with, and it's the one that creates the sharpest contrast. Yehohanan's tibia was fractured, his legs were broken, almost certainly to hasten his death once execution had gone on long enough. That was standard Roman procedure, called Crucifixion, used specifically to speed things along. The Gospel of John records something different happening at the crucifixion it describes. Soldiers broke the legs of the two men crucified on either side. When they came to the man in the center, they found he had already died, and they didn't break his legs. John connects that detail directly to a much older text, Exodus chapter 12, and its instruction that the bones of the Passover lamb were not to be broken. We're not claiming Yehohanan has any connection to that event. He doesn't. He lived and died in the same century, possibly decades apart, under the same occupying power, executed by the same method. His value isn't as evidence for one specific crucifixion. His value is as evidence for the method itself, the mechanics, the brutality, the physical reality behind language that most readers, 2,000 years removed, have flattened into symbolism. Yehohanan makes the Crucifixion detail concrete. It's not a poetic aside. It was a documented physical Roman practice, and the Gospel writer specifically records its absence as significant. You can't appreciate that significance without knowing, physically, what Crucifixion actually did to a human leg. And now, because of one bent nail in Giv'at ha-Mivtar, we do. So go back to where we started. Why is there almost no physical evidence anywhere in the archaeological record of one of history's most documented forms of execution? Because Rome was efficient. Nails were valuable. Bodies were recovered, nails were pulled, and the evidence was recycled into the next execution. and the next, disappearing by design, generation after generation. Yehohanan survived that system by accident. A nail struck a knot in a piece of olive wood, bent just enough to become useless, and was left behind in a hurry 2,000 years ago. Rome tried to erase every trace of what it did to him. It succeeded with almost everyone else who ever hung on a Roman cross. It failed with him. That's the whole story compressed into one image. A bent piece of iron, still lodged in a heel bone, in a stone box, under a Jerusalem neighborhood, for 19 centuries, the only object of its kind on Earth. If this channel is doing what it's supposed to do, you don't look at a crucifixion scene the same way again. Not the art, not the reenactments, not even the language we use to talk about it. That's the goal every time. Not a nicer story, but a truer one. If you want more of this, subscribe, because we're not done with the first century. Not even close. There's a man in the Gospel of John who shows up exactly once at first, at night, alone, afraid to be seen, asking Jesus a question about being born again. And he gets an answer built on a Greek word that means two completely different things at the same time. A word that most English translations quietly force into a single meaning. That confusion in the text isn't a mistake. It's the whole point of the scene. But here's what almost nobody remembers about that man. He shows up again, at the very end of the story, in broad daylight, spending a small fortune on burial spices for a man Rome had just executed by the exact method we spent this entire video inside of. Next time, we go back to that night conversation and forward to what that man did after it. And by the end, you'll understand why the word Jesus used may be the most misunderstood single word in the entire New Testament.